She arrived in Beirut with one suitcase, a forged passport, and a cover story built around something nobody suspects: kindness to animals. Every morning for 5 months, she walked downstairs and fed the stray cats that gathered below her apartment on Rue Verdun. The neighbors noticed. They smiled. They thought nothing of it. That was the point. Her name on the passport was Erika Chambers. She told people she was a British charity worker. She set up an easel on her balcony and painted every afternoon, the kind of quiet, unremarkable hobby that makes a person legible to their neighbors, visible enough to be familiar, boring enough to be forgotten. She was a Mossad agent. And the man she had come to Beirut to kill lived 300 meters away. Something for you before we go further, since you clearly cannot get enough of stories like these. Our limited edition ebook covers the deep cover cases that built this same doctrine. The methods, the cover structures, the operations that succeeded and the ones that collapsed. Scan the QR code on the screen to grab your copy, or click the link in the description. Then stay with us. This story is just getting started. November 1978. Beirut is not the city it was a decade earlier. The Lebanese Civil War has been burning for 3 years. Entire neighborhoods have changed hands between militias. The Palestinian Liberation Organization controls substantial territory in and around the city. Syrian-backed factions operate elsewhere. At checkpoints across the capital, armed men ask questions of everyone who passes, not because they suspect anyone specifically, but because suspicion has become the baseline condition of living here. Foreign aid workers move through this city with a particular kind of confidence. They believe their work makes them neutral. Some of them are right. Erika Chambers arrived in November and rented an apartment on Rue Verdun. She told the landlord she was with a British charitable organization supporting children in Lebanon's refugee camps. It was the kind of story that required no follow-up. It was boring. It made her exactly what every intelligence operative in a hostile environment needs to become: a person who does not invite a second look. She unpacked her suitcase. She set up the easel. She went downstairs the next morning and fed the cats. 6 years earlier, 11 Israeli athletes and coaches had been killed at the Munich Olympics. 8 Palestinian militants from the Black September organization had infiltrated the Olympic Village, taken the Israeli delegation hostage, and triggered a catastrophic rescue attempt at a German airfield that ended with all 9 remaining hostages dead. Israel received no justice through any legal channel. No court. No extradition. The men who had planned Munich remained alive, operational, protected. Within weeks of the massacre, Prime Minister Golda Meir authorized a response that was never publicly announced and carried no official name for years. It was a directive. Find the men who planned Munich. Find them wherever they are. Eliminate them. The man at the top of that list was Ali Hassan Salameh, the operations chief of Black September, the son of a Palestinian guerrilla leader, a man who had coordinated international attacks across multiple continents and who understood, with the precision of someone who had survived this long by being careful, that Israel was hunting him. He was not wrong to be careful. They had tried to kill him before. Multiple times. The worst attempt had come in the summer of 1973 in a quiet Norwegian ski town called Lillehammer, when a Mossad team tracked a man they had been told was Salameh and shot him dead in the street. He was not Salameh. He was Ahmed Bouchiki, a Moroccan waiter, married, his wife 7 months pregnant. The wrong man killed in front of witnesses in a NATO country in peacetime. Several Mossad agents were arrested. The operation became the agency's most public catastrophe. And Salameh, who heard about it in Beirut, added another layer to his security. By 1978, he was one of the most protected men in the Middle East. He moved with armed bodyguards at all times. He varied his routes. He had multiple residences. His inner circle was screened continuously for Mossad infiltration. He had also, in a detail that reads almost like provocation, married Georgina Risk, Miss Universe 1971. He moved through Beirut's social elite with the ease of a man who believed his protection was total. He was right about almost everything. Almost, there is a principle in intelligence work that is rarely discussed openly, because it sounds, when stated directly, more like strategy than ethics. The most effective cover is not the most complex one. It is the most boring one. The most effective operative is not the most skilled one. It is the one who looks most like no one. Erica Chambers was built around that principle. Her legend, the intelligence term for a fabricated identity designed to survive scrutiny, had been constructed to answer every question a curious neighbor might ask without ever triggering a second question. Where are you from? What do you do here? Do you have family? Why are you alone? The answers were simple, consistent, and they had to stop feeling rehearsed long before she arrived in Beirut. They had to become instinct, not a performance she was giving, but a life she was actually living. Because the difference between a person telling their own story and a person reciting someone else's is a thing that careful observers can feel, even when they cannot name what they are feeling. Beirut in 1978 had careful observers everywhere. She was not the only piece on the board. Before she arrived, a Mossad operative known only in intelligence accounts as Agent D had been living in Beirut under deep cover since 1974. 4 years. A different fabricated identity. A different legend. A different entry point into the world around Salome. Agent D had not tried to approach Salome directly. That would have been noticed, screened, and eliminated. Instead, he had joined the gym at the Beirut International Hotel, a venue where members of Salome's security circle were known to spend time. He played squash. He became a familiar face. Over 4 years, moving with the patience that deep cover work demands above all other qualities. He had built a detailed map of Salome's movements, the approximate hours of his departures from his residence on Rue Madame Curie, the constrained corridor of route options that Beirut's geography imposed, the specific parking area along Rue Verdun where a vehicle could be positioned and left without generating attention. He had also been in Beirut for 4 years, and long-term covers do not age well. Every relationship he had built required ongoing maintenance. Every story he had told required perfect memory. Every month that passed was another month in which a single inconsistency, remembered by the wrong person at the wrong moment, could unravel everything. He had lived, for 4 years, as someone who did not exist. That kind of sustained performance accumulates pressure in ways that are difficult to account for from the outside. Erica Chambers arrived in November 1978 as the final piece of the operation. She and Agent D almost certainly never met in Beirut. Compartmentalization was standard, each operative holding only their own fragment of the picture. She watched from the balcony. He watched from street level. Neither knew everything the other knew. What she knew was this: her apartment overlooked a specific stretch of street. Her cover had to hold for an unknown length of time. And the man she had come here for was somewhere in this city. 300 meters away, protected by people who had already caught Mossad watching once. The neighbor on the floor below had started stopping her in the stairwell. She was a Lebanese woman. Pleasant, lonely in the particular way that the war had made many people in Beirut lonely, surrounded by people but unable to fully trust any of them. She had noticed the British charity worker. She had decided to be kind. She invited her for coffee. She asked about her family. She asked about England. She asked with the genuine warmth of someone who simply wanted to know another person, in a city where knowing people had become complicated and rare. Erica Chambers said the right things. She was warm but not forthcoming. She gave enough to seem genuine and held back enough to stay safe. But the neighbor kept stopping her, kept asking, kept noticing. And somewhere in the accumulated texture of those stairwell conversations, something was registering that had not been resolved. What the neighbor had noticed and what she would do with it was not yet clear. It would not be clear for some time. The mornings had developed a rhythm she had not planned for. Down the stairs at 7. The cats came from 3 directions, A gray one from behind the building, 2 tabbies from the alley to the left, a thin black one she had started thinking of as the nervous one because it always held back until the others had eaten. She brought the same food every day. She used the same route down the stairs. She wore the same expression, unhurried, domestic. The face of a woman whose largest concern was whether the nervous cat would eat enough. She had not decided to become attached to the cats. That had happened on its own. That was the first thing that worried her. Cover identities are built from the outside in. You construct the behavior, the habit, the visible life, and over time, the interior follows. That is the theory. What intelligence professionals who have survived long-term infiltrations describe, when they describe it at all, is something slightly different. The cover does not just become comfortable. It begins to feel more stable than the truth. The person you actually are starts to seem like the fiction, and the name on the forged passport starts to feel like the one that fits. Erika Chambers had been in Beirut for 11 weeks. She was, by all available evidence, performing without error. The cover was holding. The neighbors had absorbed her. The checkpoint officials had processed her without comment. The aid organization she nominally represented had received no inquiries about her. But she had started naming the cats in her head, not aloud. In her head, and she knew, with the part of her that was still the person she had been before she arrived, that this was not a neutral development. The problem with deep cover work is not the questions you are asked. It is the questions you cannot ask anyone else. She could not contact her handler to say, "I think I am losing the edge between myself and the cover." She could not send word back to say, "The neighbor downstairs is asking questions that are getting harder to deflect." She could not signal, "Something in this city feels like it is tightening, and I cannot tell if I am reading it correctly or imagining it." The intelligence architecture of the operation had been designed for exactly this isolation. Compartmentalization meant that she held her fragment and no one else held all of it. It was correct tradecraft. It was also, in the 11th week of a sustained performance with no certain end date, a condition that had its own specific weight. She painted on the balcony every afternoon. The easel was positioned so that her eyes, when she looked up from the canvas, fell naturally on the stretch of roof or dune below. The painting gave her a reason to look. It gave her a reason to be still. It gave anyone watching from the street a completely legible explanation for why this woman sat on her balcony every afternoon. It was a good cover. She knew it was a good cover. She also knew that she had now been using it for 11 weeks, which meant 11 weeks of paintings that she had to maintain, discard, or explain. She had started actually painting. Agent D's situation had its own deterioration. He had been in Beirut since 1974. By the winter of 1978, that was 4.5 years under a name that was not his own, in a city that had grown steadily more dangerous as the Civil War progressed. His access to Salameh's periphery had been built through patience, so extreme it required a particular kind of psychological architecture. The ability to want nothing visibly. To push for nothing. To simply be present and unremarkable across months and then years of contact with people he could not trust. He had achieved what he was sent to achieve. He had mapped Salameh's movement patterns in granular detail. He knew the route. He knew the timing. He had positioned the explosive device in the surveilled parking spot with the care of someone who understood that one misplaced detail destroyed everything. But 4.5 years in, covers develop fissures that no one builds into the original plan. He had relationships in Beirut now, real ones, in the sense that the people in them believed they were real. Men he had played squash with for years. People who had shared meals with him, known him in the ordinary way that people in the same city know each other over time. And those relationships had their own memory. They held 4 years of specific things he had said, specific positions he had taken, specific reactions he had shown. Consistency over 4 years is a different problem than consistency over 4 weeks. The longer the legend runs, the more it has committed to. The more it has committed to, the more ways it can break. He was not breaking. But the pressure was not invisible to the people who were monitoring the operation from Tel Aviv. There had been a conversation, not in Beirut, a communication through the channels that the operation's architecture permitted, careful and stripped of detail. The substance of it, as reconstructed from intelligence retrospectives, was this: there was a discussion about whether to abort, not abandon the target, pull the assets. The reasoning was not cowardice. It was mathematics. Agent D had been in place too long. The statistical probability that a 4.5-year cover had developed undetected cracks, had generated observations in someone's memory that had not yet been connected into suspicion, was not negligible. The longer he remained, the more that probability accumulated. Eureka Chambers had been in place 11 weeks. Her cover was newer, which meant it had less history to contradict, but also less established routine to protect her. She was in an earlier, more fragile phase of the same problem. Pulling both of them out meant losing the investment. It meant Salome survived. It meant the operation that had consumed years of planning, that had built an intelligence picture of his movements with a precision that might never be replicable, ended without resolution. Leaving them in meant accepting a risk that was growing, not shrinking, with every week that passed. The decision was to continue. But the conversation had happened. And it left something behind, a recalibration of what everyone involved understood about how much margin actually remained. Then the neighbor came upstairs. Not a chance meeting in the stairwell this time. She knocked on the door. She had brought something. A small dish of food. The specific gesture of a woman who has decided that a person living alone needs to be looked after. She came inside. She sat down. She looked around the apartment with the natural curiosity of a guest seeing a space for the first time. And her eyes moved across the easel, the paintings stacked against the wall, the single suitcase still visible at the back of the bedroom because there had never seemed to be a reason to hide it. She asked about the suitcase. It was a completely ordinary question. The kind of thing anyone might ask, noticing a suitcase in a bedroom after someone has lived in a place for nearly 3 months. She asked it lightly, without any edge. Chambers answered. She said something about not having fully unpacked, the way people who know they might move again never quite settle in. She said it the way someone says something that is both true within the cover and designed to close the question. The neighbor nodded. She accepted it. She stayed for 20 minutes. She talked about her own family, the neighborhood, the way the city had changed since the war began. Before she left, she looked at the paintings. She said they were good. She said she had not expected them to be so good, which was not an accusation but was also not nothing. It was the observation of a person who had formed an expectation and found it exceeded, which meant she had been forming expectations. She left. The door closed. Chambers stood in the apartment and understood, with the clarity that comes from adrenaline that has nowhere to go, that the neighbor was paying more attention than she had initially assessed. The question that had been seated in the stairwell conversations was now larger. The neighbor was not an intelligence operative. She was not affiliated with the Plo's security apparatus, as far as could be determined. She was a civilian woman being kind in a city where kindness had become a form of resistance against the grinding reality of the war. But civilians talk. They mention things. In a city layered with surveillance and counterintelligence, a civilian who mentions the British woman upstairs, who has only one suitcase after 3 months, whose paintings are better than expected, who is guarded in a way that reads as private but registers as something slightly else, to the wrong person, in the wrong moment, does not need to intend any harm. The cover was holding. That was the accurate assessment. Nothing had been reported. Nothing had been acted on. The cover was holding for now. Which was a different thing. And the cats needed feeding in the morning, which meant she would walk downstairs at 7, and the neighbors would see her and find her ordinary and familiar and completely explicable. And somewhere in that visibility the operation would either survive or it would not. She did not know which. Neither did anyone else. December passed without a clean window. Salome's convoy ran the Rue Verdun corridor 4 times in the first 3 weeks of the month. Each time, something was wrong. The angle was not confirmed. The bodyguard configuration was different than the pattern Agent D had mapped. Once, a second vehicle appeared in the convoy that had not appeared before. A precaution. Possibly random. Possibly not. The addition of one unaccounted vehicle changed the geometry of what a detonation would do and where the blast radius would fall. She watched from the balcony. She did not push the button. She painted instead. The false start came on December 19th. Salome's Chevrolet came down the route at the expected hour. The configuration matched. The timing matched. She had the remote in her hand. A child ran into the street from the building on the left side of Rue Verdun. 8 years old, possibly younger, chasing something that had rolled off the pavement. The child was directly in the blast corridor. She waited. The child's mother came out of the building entrance 20 seconds later, grabbed the child by the arm, pulled him back onto the pavement. By then, Salome's convoy had cleared the zone. She put the remote down on the balcony table. She picked up the brush. Her hand was steady. That steadiness was the thing she would think about later, in a way she could not fully explain, not pride, not relief, simply the observation that her hand had been steady when it had no reason to be. January brought a different kind of pressure. Agent D's position had been deteriorating in a way that was not dramatic but was measurable. One of the men in his squash network had begun asking questions about his plans, whether he intended to stay in Beirut long term, whether he had considered leaving given how the city was developing. It was the kind of question that friends ask each other. It was also the kind of question that a person under surveillance asks when they have been instructed to establish intent. There was no way to know which it was. That was the precise problem. He flagged it through the appropriate channel. The response from Tel Aviv was to continue. Assess. Do not alter behavior. Do not accelerate. Do not accelerate meant, do not create pressure on the Beirut end that forces a decision before the conditions are right. She received no direct communication about any of this. She was not supposed to. She was watching from the balcony, maintaining the cover, feeding the cats, and waiting for a confluence of conditions that had not yet arrived. The assumption that was playing out incorrectly was about PLO counterintelligence. The operation had been built on the correct assessment that Black September's security apparatus would not profile a British female charity worker as a viable threat. That assessment was right, but it had generated a secondary assumption that was slightly off, that PLO counterintelligence was primarily focused outward, on identifying Mossad assets before they could get close. The actual orientation, as it existed on the ground in January 1979, was partly inward. Salome's security had become increasingly focused on his own immediate circle, on the possibility of a betrayal from within rather than a penetration from outside. The Lillehammer disaster had demonstrated to Palestinian intelligence that Mossad got its information somewhere, and the somewhere they were most concerned about was their own people. This meant the surveillance pressure in Salome's immediate environment was directed at people who already knew him, not at foreign civilians living on nearby streets. It also meant that the external cover, the aid worker, the painter, the woman with the cats, was even less scrutinized than the operational plan had assumed. She was not on their radar because she was not the shape of thing they were looking for. She was not the shape of thing they were looking for because they were looking inward. The deception was working better than designed. For reasons no one on the operational side had precisely calibrated. That should have been reassuring. It was not entirely. January 18th. 4 days before the operation, she had been watching the route for 2 weeks with renewed intensity after the December near execution. Salome's pattern had restabilized. The convoy configuration had returned to the baseline Agent D had mapped. The second vehicle that had appeared in December was gone. She wrote nothing down. Everything was held in memory and observation. On the afternoon of the 18th, the neighbor knocked again. She had brought coffee this time, already made, in a small pot, the kind of gesture that carries an expectation of time rather than a quick exchange at the door. She came in. She sat in the same chair she had used before. She asked whether Chambers had heard about the incident 2 streets over. A militia checkpoint had been moved. There had been some kind of confrontation. The neighborhood had been unsettled for 2 days. She was asking in the way that people in Beirut asked about such things, gathering information, comparing accounts, trying to construct a map of what was happening and what it meant for daily movement. Chambers answered. She had heard nothing because she had been home. She said this carefully. The cover required her to seem appropriately cautious about movement during disturbances, which was both true to the character and true to the operational requirement of staying in position. The neighbor said something then that landed differently than anything she had said before. She said, "You are very good at being by yourself." She said it as a compliment, or at least as an observation offered without visible judgment. She meant that Chambers seemed comfortable with solitude, that she did not seem frightened by being alone in the apartment during disturbances the way some of the other foreign women in the building had been. Chambers said thank you. She offered nothing more. After the neighbor left, she stood at the window and understood that the compliment was also a question that had not been asked directly. A person who is very good at being by themselves in a city at war is either someone who has made peace with the situation or someone who has specific reasons not to be afraid. The neighbor had not said this. She had perhaps not even thought it in those terms, but she had noticed it. She kept noticing things. January 21st. The day before. Salome's convoy ran the route in the early afternoon. Everything aligned. The configuration was correct. The vehicle was in position. She had the remote in her hand. She did not push the button. The reason was not the child this time. The reason was a car she did not recognize, parked on the far side of Rue Verdun in a position that partially blocked her sightline to the rigged Volkswagen. Not blocking it entirely. Partially, enough that the confirmation she needed, visual certainty that the blast would reach the convoy, was fractionally degraded. She put the remote down. The convoy passed. Salome went wherever he was going. She stood on the balcony and looked at the unrecognized car for another 20 minutes. It was, eventually, driven away by a man she did not recognize who appeared to have no connection to anything. He had simply parked there, briefly, the way people park in cities. She had aborted for a parked car. That night she went over every element of what she knew. The route, the configuration, the timing, the blast radius. The variables she could control and the variables she could not. The variable she kept returning to was not tactical. It was the neighbor. Whatever the neighbor had noticed, or was in the process of noticing, was going to continue accumulating. There was no action Chambers could take to slow it. Being warmer would seem like a change in behavior. Being cooler would also seem like a change in behavior. The only available response was to continue being exactly what she had been, which meant continuing to give the neighbor new observations to accumulate. At some point, accumulation becomes pattern. Pattern becomes suspicion. She did not know where in that sequence the neighbor currently was. She had no way to know. What she knew was that the window, defined not just by Salome's pattern, but by the operational integrity of everything holding the operation together, was narrowing in ways that had nothing to do with the weather, or the parked car, or the convoy configuration. The morning after the morning after the morning she had aborted was January 22nd. She set the alarm. She put the remote on the table beside the easel. She went to sleep. The explosion was heard across 6 city blocks. She was already inside the apartment when the sound registered. Not running, not crouched. Simply standing away from the balcony in the position of someone who had just come in from outside and had not yet had a reason to leave again. The remote was on the table. She put it in her bag. She moved with the speed of someone who understood that the next 10 minutes were as critical as everything that had preceded them. The hallway filled with noise. Neighbors opening doors, voices asking what had happened, where it had come from, whether it was a shell or a bomb or something else, the particular vocabulary of a city that had learned to categorize explosions by sound. She stepped into the hallway. She looked appropriately shaken. She said she did not know what had happened. She said the sound had been very close. She said she needed to sit down. The neighbor from the floor below was in the hallway. They looked at each other across the distance of 3 or 4 meters, in the particular way that people look at each other in the immediate aftermath of something violent, searching for information in the other person's face, trying to read whether they know more than they are saying. Chambers held the expression she needed to hold: confusion, distress, the natural physical response of someone in proximity to a large explosion they had not anticipated. The neighbor stepped toward her and put a hand on her arm. She said, "Come downstairs. Come sit with me." Chambers said she needed a moment. She said the sound had affected her more than she expected, which was true in a way she could not have explained. She said she would come down in a little while. She asked the neighbor, and this was the sentence she had prepared, the sentence she had held in reserve for this exact moment, to watch the cats while she rested. The neighbor said of course. She went back inside and closed the door. She was out of the apartment within 40 minutes. Not running. Not through any back exit. She walked out of the building with a bag, the way a woman who has just experienced a frightening afternoon in a city at war might walk out of her building to go somewhere she felt safer. She did not look back at the building. She did not look toward Rue Verdun. She met the exfiltration in the pattern that had been established before she arrived in Beirut. She left the city. She crossed back into territory where she was no longer Erika Chambers and had not been for 11 years, or 5 months, depending on which version of time you were measuring. In the apartment on Rue Verdun she left the easel, the paintings, the personal effects that belonged to the cover, and the British passport issued in the name of Erika Chambers. She left the passport deliberately. This detail is not incidental. A cover operative leaving a document behind is not carelessness. It is a choice about what the investigators who arrive afterward will spend their time on. The passport led Lebanese authorities to a name. The name led nowhere. Every hour they spent tracing Erika Chambers was an hour spent moving away from the actual person who had left Beirut that afternoon. Ali Hassan Salameh was pulled from the wreckage of his convoy alive. He was conscious when the first responders reached him. He was transported to the American University Hospital in Beirut, where he died on the operating table. The Wrath of God operation, 7 years, multiple countries, 1 catastrophic misidentification in Norway, 5 failed attempts, was complete. The immediate framing in intelligence circles was success. The target was dead. The assets had exfiltrated. The cover had held. No Mossad operative had been captured or identified. That framing was not wrong. It was incomplete. Salameh's death did not collapse Black September. The organization had already been in structural decline before January 1979. Its most visible international operations had wound down under political pressure to shift tactics. What the assassination eliminated was the man, not the architecture he had helped build. Force 17, the PLO's elite protective unit that Salameh had founded, continued operating. The intelligence networks he had managed did not dissolve with him. They were absorbed, redistributed, rebuilt under different leadership over the following years. The deterrence effect was real, but not total. Surviving PLO security figures tightened their operational practices, varied their patterns with a new urgency, and drew the correct conclusion from Beirut that Mossad had maintained a long-term presence in the city that their own counterintelligence had not detected. That last conclusion was the one that mattered most. Because the question it forced was not how Mossad had gotten so close. It was where Mossad had placed someone they had not found. And the answer, a British charity worker, a painter, a woman who fed stray cats every morning for 5 months, rewrote the threat model for every subsequent PLO security assessment. The assumption that surveillance came from a particular shape of person in a particular configuration was no longer usable. The entire category of low-threat foreign civilian presence had to be reassessed. That reassessment cost them operationally. It created friction, suspicion, and internal review processes that slowed their own work and generated paranoia within the organization at exactly the moment when the organization needed cohesion. The cover that was built to protect one operation changed how an entire intelligence apparatus thought about cover for years afterward. In 2010, a British man named Peter Keeley came forward publicly and stated that Mossad had used his real biographical details as the basis for the forged Erika Chambers passport. He was not the only British citizen to make that claim in relation to the Salome operation. The British government filed formal objections. The diplomatic consequences were managed, contained, and eventually absorbed. No rupture of lasting significance occurred. But the people whose identities had been used without consent had spent 30 years not knowing. Keeley described it as finding out that someone had lived a life in your name, done something in your name, and you had no knowledge of it and no ability to have prevented it. That is a specific kind of violation. It is not the same as being a victim of violence. It is something quieter and harder to name. The woman who became Erika Chambers never gave an interview. Her real name remains unconfirmed in any declassified record. What is known about her aftermath comes through the same indirect channels as everything else. Former Mossad officials speaking in abstract terms about what this kind of work costs the people who do it. What they describe is not instability, not breakdown, something more durable and less visible than either. She had maintained a false identity in a hostile city for 5 months. She had built genuine feeling relationships with people who believed she was someone she was not. She had sat on a balcony and confirmed a target with her own eyes and pushed a button, and then walked into a hallway and performed shock in front of a woman who had been kind to her. And she had asked that woman to feed the cats. The neighbor had said yes. Because the neighbor believed she knew who she was asking. The cover did not end when she left Beirut. The cover ended the ability to return. To the city, to the relationships, to any version of the person those neighbors thought they had known. The woman who had been Erika Chambers for 5 months could not go back and explain. She could not go back and be known as herself. The specific human texture of those months, the neighbor, the cats, the woman who had been walking on the wrong side of Rue Verdun when the bomb went off, existed now only inside her. What she carried after she left was not the operation. It was the weight of what maintaining the lie had required her to do to people who had never chosen to be part of it. The doctrine that made this operation possible, the long legend, the deep-cover female operative, the years-long patient construction of a life that could survive daily scrutiny in a denied-access environment, did not originate with Erika Chambers. It had predecessors, cases that built the method, tested it, broke it, and rebuilt it across decades before a woman with a forged British passport arrived in Beirut with one suitcase and set up an easel on a balcony. Those cases are not in any public file. Some of them are in the ebook we put together in the description below, an operational record of the deep cover cases that built Mossad's long legend doctrine. The methods, the cover structures, the operations that succeeded and the ones that collapsed, and what the agency learned from each. The link is in the description. If something in this story stayed with you, the neighbor, the passport, the woman walking on the wrong side of the street, leave it in the comments. Those details are the ones that tend to mean something different to different people. I want to know which one stopped you.